thank you, President Chang, and new President Wang, and Chairman Pan for inviting me to this great event. We've already seen some very exciting and inspiring parts of what this organization does, and so it's really an honor for me to be here. One of the things I will talk about is our role at NASA in trying to inspire the next generation. We talk about our missions, we talk about our journey back to the moon and onto Mars, we talk about our science discoveries, but really as part of the United States government and part of the federal government agencies and part of society, our role is also to inspire that next generation of explorers. So I'll talk a bit about that. So I'll give you an overview. I'm going to break this into three parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about NASA and NASA Ames Research Center, which is a center located right here in the Bay Area. I will talk a bit about our missions, and then I'll give you a little bit of personal history and journey if I have time. Oops, the wrong way. Okay, so when people think about NASA and what NASA does, they usually think about the Apollo program, the Space Shuttle, the International Space Station, and our Mars rovers. But this is a chart that kind of gives you a sense that NASA is much broader than that. The first A in NASA does stand for aeronautics, and I'll talk a little bit about the continued work we do in aviation and aeronautics. The next two lines, space operations and deep space exploration systems, is about humans extending human presence to low Earth orbit and then beyond low Earth orbit, eventually back to the moon and onto Mars. Science is a very big part of NASA. The NASA budget for science now is about $8 billion a year. It's a one-third of the investment of the entire NASA budget. But what many people don't know is out of the 120 or 130 spacecraft that NASA currently has, about a third of them are Earth-observing missions. They're looking back at the Earth, trying to understand what's happening to our climate, the atmosphere, the land, the oceans, from the unique vantage point of space. So there's a big part of science that's dedicated to Earth science and understanding our home planet. And then we also understand at NASA that technology is a big part of what we do and how we get that work done. A major portion of the NASA budget is devoted to technology, and it's about bringing technology in from the outside, partnering with our commercial partners and academic institutions, but it's also about disseminating that technology that we have to develop for our space missions and aeronautics missions back for public benefit. If you look back at the original law that was written for NASA, establishing NASA in 1958, you will actually see language in the conference report that says one of the main purposes and missions of NASA is to disseminate the knowledge, the technology, and the developments for public benefit. So where are the NASA centers? There are 10 NASA centers across the country. Most people know about Houston. Most people know about Kennedy Space Center in Florida, but there are 10 centers. And here in California, it's the only state that has more than one NASA center. We have 3 NASA centers in California. There's Ames Research Center, the center I run right here in Silicon Valley. There is Armstrong Flight Research Center, co-located with Edwards Air Force Base in the Mojave Desert, where we do most of our flight testing. And then there's the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL, which is run by Caltech for NASA and does most of, or many of our planetary science missions. So even though NASA is spread across the country, what I like to highlight here is being right here in the heart of Silicon Valley is a very important part of NASA. And so the Ames Research Center here, which I'll talk a little bit more about in its history, is one of the centers that does research and therefore does all of those areas that you saw in the first chart. Many of NASA's centers are focused in one or more area. Houston and Kennedy, for example, are primarily focused on human spaceflight. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory and Goddard Space Flight Center are primarily focused on science missions. But as a research center, Ames, located right here, is actually working in every one of those areas because the technology and the science that needs to be developed to do those kind of missions in the future cross-cut all the different disciplines. I also like to mention here that we take advantage of the entrepreneurial and innovation spirit that's really part of the ecosystem here in Silicon Valley. but we also have our challenges. If you look at the locations of all the NASA centers, we're located in arguably the most expensive place to live, some of the most challenging commutes, as you all know. And so having a federal lab and a NASA center located right here in the heart of the Bay Area is also a challenge for us in terms of recruitment and retention. So, saw a lot of great charts earlier about history. So we've got a history as well. We're actually the second oldest NASA center. We started in 1939. We celebrated our 83rd anniversary just recently. Our first center, the first NASA center, established at the same time as CIE-USA in 1917. This is the Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia, started back in 1917, 106 years ago. So this was all started before even NASA was formed. At that time, there was the NACA, the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, which was established shortly after the Wright brothers discovered flight. And so these four centers, first Langley, then Ames, and the other two centers you see on this chart, were all established to advance aviation and aeronautics initially, and became the first four centers to be part of NASA in 1958, 1959. And then the rest of the NASA centers were built after that time period. I like to show off some of these pictures here. Those of you who have been in the Bay Area a long time, it doesn't look like the Bay Area. This is right next to Mountain View and Sunnyvale now. And when we were established, there wasn't anything out there but farmlands and orchards. And so obviously, we've grown quite a bit since that time period. And you can see some images there that really highlight that the early days of NASA Ames was in aeronautics and aerothermodynamics. So our center today looks like this. It's, as I mentioned, right off of Mountain View and Sunnyvale in Moffett Field. You're looking at the sort of a bird's eye view of it. The big structure on the upper left of the image there is the largest wind tunnel in the world. It is also the second largest wind tunnel in the world. There are two test sections in that tunnel. The largest test section is 80 feet by 120 feet. So you can put a full-size commercial aircraft inside that tunnel, which we do, to understand the aerodynamics around aircraft. We have a host of other facilities around, smaller tunnels that go higher speed, so subsonic, transonic, supersonic, and hypersonic speeds, several times the speed of sound. And we also have test facilities that are dedicated to test entry conditions, conditions by which a spacecraft will re-enter the Earth's atmosphere or enter another planetary atmosphere like Mars or Venus or Jupiter and have extreme heating conditions. And how do we develop the materials to protect those spacecraft as well as their cargo and their crew? You can also see on the right side of the image, about where you see some red roof buildings there, that used to be Moffett Field Naval Air Station. That was a naval air station that was closed by the DoD in the mid-90s, and NASA took over the entire property. So we went from about 400 acres of property to about 2,000 acres of federal property right in the heart of Silicon Valley. We've leased out many of that space, much of that space. Google is one of our major lease partners, as well as some other entities. And we turned a major part of the historic district, where you see the green parade ground and the buildings around that area, we turned that into a research park. So we lease out land, we lease out buildings, we lease out offices, primarily for entities that really want to be co-located with NASA and share in the development of the technologies and the missions. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So what's the work we do today? You saw the earlier images where we were primarily working in aerodynamics. This gives you a sense of the 8 core areas for NASA Ames today. And I won't go through these in detail, but there really are 3 phases to our history. There were the early days before NASA was formed, when we were part of NACA, and our primary mission at that time was aviation, aeronautics, and testing. Then during the part from the late 50s to about the 70s, we were part of NASA's missions in space and science. If you remember missions like Pioneer, Galileo, Viking, these were all missions that NASA Ames had a major role in. And then, as I often tell my neighbors, we were here long before Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley didn't come into being until about the 70s. And so the last 4 or 5 decades now, we've been part of the Silicon Valley community. and bringing information sciences, information technology, advanced computing, quantum computing, as well as AI, robotics, and other areas to the NASA missions. The topics of the conference today, in artificial intelligence, for example, and cybersecurity, while we're primarily worried about how we deal with those topics here on Earth, it's a very, very significant challenge for the future of aviation as well as the future of space exploration. And we have a host of facilities in our laboratory. We have, as I mentioned, the largest wind tunnels and with the fastest wind tunnels in the agency. There's an example on the lower left there of the large wind tunnel test section. You can see people down at the bottom, so you can get an idea of how big the test section is. And that's testing parachutes that have to be this large to land spacecraft on Mars, for example. Because the Martian atmosphere is so thin, you have to have parachutes that can handle this type of atmospheric conditions to provide enough drag to slow the vehicle down. We have the largest and the only ArcJet complex in the agency, and this is a high-temperature, high-speed facility to test materials that will face about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit of temperatures as they enter atmosphere of another planet, like Mars, or return to the Earth's atmosphere. And so we do that. This facility takes about 60 megawatts of power to operate. And when we do run it, we are basically providing all that energy on a coupon or test size article about that size. So you can imagine the amount of energy it takes to even try to get close to understanding on the ground what happens during those atmospheric entry conditions. Simulation is a big part of what we do as well. On the lower end of that simulator line, we have the largest motion-based simulator in the world. It's called the Vertical Motion Simulator. Human in the loop is a very big part of what we have to study and understand. I often get asked the question, what do I see as the biggest challenges for the future of artificial intelligence and AI and autonomy? I don't think the biggest challenges are in making our systems smarter and introducing more autonomy and AI into them. I think the biggest challenge is going to be how humans interface with those systems. If you look at where the major mishaps and failures happen, there's always something going on between the interface of the human and those systems. And that's partly because the human is part of those systems, and the human is the least predictable part of the system and most likely the least understood part of the system. And so when you look at autopilots on airplanes, self-driving cars, all sorts of other technologies that we're beginning to rely on, even in space travel, a lot of the issues that come up are how humans will interact with those systems. And does a human understand what the system is going to do? And does the system know what type of inputs it's getting from the human to provide the right answers? And then supercomputing, we run the agency's primary supercomputing facility. So a lot of dependency nowadays, as all of us engineers know, on modeling and simulation. We still are going to rely on testing. Physical testing is absolutely going to be required. Ground-based testing and flight testing will be absolutely required for almost everything we do. But the computational modeling allows us to do less of that testing, allows us to explore a broader design environment before we put more dollars into the actual tests, because testing is usually much more expensive than running on computers. So that is one key aspect of how we do the engineering today. So I mentioned a little bit more about the Moffett complex. The image here you're seeing, the cyan or blue image, sort of up towards the top left, is what is the core part of the NASA Research Center, Ames Research Center. The green area is the airfield. It's a federal airfield, and it continues to be operated as a federal airfield. The orange area to the left, the yellowish orange area, is what was the Navy Historic District, which is now the Research Park. And I want to bring your attention to the red area. The red triangle area is about 36 acres on our property that we have leased out to UC Berkeley. And so UC Berkeley is in the process of establishing and building a campus on site. It'll be a satellite campus to their main campus, and they have plans in the long term to bring their newly established aerospace engineering program on site with us. And so if you can imagine the future of a NASA Research Center to include a major academic partner on site with us, the access to the students, the access to the faculty, the opportunity for joint appointments, and the shared facilities, it really creates a new environment for research in the future that will very much tie a NASA Research Center with an academic presence. So I'd like to just spend a little bit of time and talk about some of our missions. And I'm going to break this up into several areas. In aeronautics research, we still do quite a bit of aeronautics research. Even though that was in our history, it is not the major part of the NASA budget now. Out of about $26 billion, about $1 billion is dedicated to aeronautics and aviation now. But we're still doing cutting edge research. We're still trying to buy down risk for industry. We're still trying to push the envelope of what we understand in flight. Part of what we do at Ames has been primarily tying that together with our roles in autonomy and robotics and looking at the explosion now in unpiloted vehicles or drones. How do we actually better use our airspace? Can we really do cargo delivery with drones? Are we going to be able to do air taxis? And then how are we going to integrate those vehicles safely into an airspace environment that includes both piloted and unpiloted vehicles? Our current airspace system is the safest in the world, but we only handle about maybe 10,000 aircraft per day over the US at any given time. We expect, the FAA expects that number to go up to 100,000 or even millions by the time everybody wants to do what they want to do with these unpiloted vehicles. So how do we continue to maintain a safe system, and how do we scale up? Because the current system that's still largely based on radar tracks and communications won't scale up by an order of magnitude or more. And so that's one of the research topics that we focus on here at Ames Research Center. We continue to do aviation testing. We continue to look at new vehicles and new technologies. And we continue to look at uses of drones and other things for regional impacts in areas such as wildfire research, as well as disaster resilience, which is a very big issue here in the state of California. One of the areas that we are very interested in is, can we learn to fly, can we figure out how to fly supersonic over land without having a sonic boom? That is what basically made the Concorde not economically viable. The Concorde could fly supersonic over water, but could not fly supersonic over land, and therefore it was extremely inefficient to fly over land, and it also, many routes it could not fly because it couldn't fly over land, supersonic. So can we develop and shape a vehicle? So we've got a vehicle currently being built. It's being built for us by Lockheed Skunk Works down in Southern California, and it's going to demonstrate whether we can truly fly over land and not get the sonic boom that would be unacceptable to almost everybody on the ground. And it's one of the key research areas that we're involved in. Advanced air mobility is another area I had just touched upon. Understanding how drones and how unpiloted vehicles carrying people or cargo will operate safely in a future aviation system. That's a key area of research for us, and one that we're looking to advance for public benefit. Just last December, we were able to launch the first Artemis mission. This is Artemis 1. So this is part of the strategy to return to the moon with humans. And this was a mission that was uncrewed. It was the SLS, the Space Launch System, as well as the Orion capsule. It flew out to the moon in a retrograde lunar orbit. It was a very successful mission. It demonstrated that the Space Launch System works, it demonstrated the Orion capsule worked, and it demonstrated that we could protect that capsule and that vehicle as it re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. So that was an exciting mission, but what comes next is Artemis 2. Artemis 2 is scheduled to launch in late 2024 and will be the first crewed mission that will go back to the moon. The crew was just announced a couple weeks ago, and so that's the plan now, is to now test out the environmental control systems, test out many of the other systems that the crew will have to be involved in. And it's very similar back in the Apollo days to the Apollo 8 mission. So the Apollo 11 mission was the first one that landed on the moon, but many of the Apollo missions before that were advancing the technology or demonstrating or proving out the technology. And the Apollo 8 mission was the first mission that went in orbit around the moon and came back with humans. And so that's what the Artemis 2 mission will be about, coming in end of 2024. And the next mission to the moon for NASA is actually run from Ames. It's called Viper, and this is a lunar prospecting mission. This is a mission to go to the south pole of the moon to confirm, which we already know through our measurements and observations, confirm the presence of water ice in the permanently shadowed craters of the moon. And if we can get access to that water ice, if it's easy to access, then now you have access to water, you have access to oxygen, and you have access to hydrogen, which is fuel. And so this could completely change the way we do space exploration in the future if we could actually use the resources on the moon to further basically being on the moon, but also onto Mars. So this gives you an example of the rover and the instruments on it. It's currently being built. It's a lot bigger than the picture might look like. The rover is about 500 kilograms in weight. The mast stands about 8 feet tall, so it's about the size of a Mini Cooper car. And it will be delivered to the south pole of the moon, also in late 2024. So just to give an example of why we're going back to the moon, some people do ask that. We've been to the moon before. Why are we going back? And so one of the key reasons to go back is we proved that we could go to the moon in the Apollo program, but we only did so for a few days at a time. And we had very limited ability to stay there and learn how to operate and live there. So the missions to the moon now are more about proving that we can actually live and operate on another planetary surface for long periods of time. A mission for humans to Mars and return will be a multi-year mission. Just the time it takes to get there, and the time it takes to get back, and the time you have to wait for the realignment of the planets is going to make it a multi-year mission. We cannot do a multi-year mission today on another planetary surface and have the reliability and the safety we think we need for humans to be there. And we can do the robotic missions, but of course you're willing and able to take much higher risks with robots. And so many of the systems we need to have and the reliability of those systems need to be proven out on the moon before we can venture out and try to put humans on Mars. The International Space Station, it's been in continuous operation for over 20 years now, and it's a key part of our strategy of how to extend life beyond low Earth orbit. I love to tell students, whether you're in high school or even in college now, think about this for a moment. For your entire life, there's always been some person who's not been living on the surface of this planet. That's how long the International Space Station has been in continuous operations with crew. Now, of course, we rotate the crew in and out of there. No crew stays there for more than a year. Usually it's about 6 months at a time. But it's a pretty significant accomplishment for humankind to be able to operate in space continuously with people for over 20 years now. What do we use the International Space Station for? It's a perfect proving ground for a microgravity environment for space biology. And so at Ames Research Center, we have sent the most number of biological experiments to the moon, over 90 now, where we look at microorganisms, we look at fruit flies, we look at rodents. We're really trying to understand the biology of long duration space travel, both from a microgravity and from a radiation perspective. And so those are the things that we use the International Space Station to, and the United States right now is committed to keep the International Space Station operating until 2030, and most of our international partners have already signed on to keep it operating until 2030, and then we hope possibly to turn that over to commercial operations. And then it can be a laboratory in low Earth orbit that has commercial value in addition to government research value. So to finish up the missions, getting to Mars is actually quite challenging. This is a rough graphic of 60 years of missions to Mars worldwide. Each of the colors represent different countries, some that don't exist anymore in their current form. What's interesting about this chart is over half the missions that humans have sent to Mars have failed. Now, we've had a string of successes. The last decade has been some outstanding successes, including countries that have made it to Mars successfully for the first time on their first try. India, UAE, and China, for example, have gotten to the Mars on their first try successfully. That's quite an achievement, but the history is challenging. Over 50% of the missions have failed, and the number of successful landings and operations on Mars is still around a dozen out of all those missions that have gone. And so it's a very challenging environment. One of the reasons it's so challenging is because the Martian atmosphere is the worst of both worlds. It is too thin to slow you down fast enough, like the Earth's atmosphere is thick enough that you can slow down quickly, but it is thick enough to still burn you up if you don't go in correctly and you don't have the right systems to slow you down. So it's a very, very challenging environment, and that's one of the things that we have to continue to develop and understand the technologies of how to do this. We, of course, are on Mars today, and the Mars Perseverance rover is operating quite well, and it carried a helicopter called Ingenuity, so we demonstrated, with JPL leading it, the first ability to fly on another planetary surface. This was the Ingenuity helicopter on Mars. That can open up a whole new set of opportunities for exploration of Mars, because now you can traverse much greater distances in a much shorter amount of time if you can fly, as opposed to just drive around relatively slowly. So these are an example of the various different technologies that Ames has been involved in helping to get our missions to Mars successful. Okay, I think, one other Mars mission I want to highlight. This mission has already been approved. It is the next major campaign of missions to Mars, because it is about bringing a sample back from Mars. We have never brought a sample back from Mars. Of course, we brought moon rocks back from the moon. We've taken samples from asteroids and comets, but we've never brought a sample back from Mars. And this is a holy grail, if you will, for geologists. They want to actually have a sample that they could actually study in the highly capable laboratories here on Earth. Because the instruments and the laboratory capabilities that you can put on the surface of Mars are going to be limited by definition, both in terms of mass and power. And so this is a campaign of missions that will take about a decade. It'll take up to three, possibly four separate launches to Mars. First is with Perseverance now that's on Mars. It's already collecting the samples, and it's caching the samples and sealing them and putting them on the surface of Mars. The next mission will go to get those samples and deliver that to an ascent vehicle that will then launch those samples into Martian orbit. And then a third launch will have to occur to go pick up those samples from Martian orbit and bring it back to Earth. And so that's a 10-year campaign of missions, with launches hopefully in 2026, 2028, and out in 2030 to basically bring back samples. And it will be the first round-trip mission to another planet of any kind. So if we want to be able to send humans to Mars and bring them back, we're going to need to be able to do this kind of robotic mission first and demonstrate the reliability and the technology that's capable of doing that. And then, of course, we're also very interested in science that goes beyond our solar system. These are just images from the amazing James Webb Space Telescope. Some of you have probably seen these already. This is looking back almost to the beginning of time. The universe is estimated to be about 13 billion years old. And the further out you look, the further back in time you're looking, because the light coming from how far out you're looking takes that long to get to Earth. And so we are looking back close to 13 billion years now with instruments like the James Webb Space Telescope. One of the questions about what kind of science can you do from the moon involves using the far side of the moon, which is always the far side of the moon, and shielded from the Earth, from all the electromagnetic interference from the Earth. It's a very quiet zone, and so you can have very sensitive radio telescopes deployed on the far side of the moon and actually pick up signals from deep space almost to the beginning of time, over 13 billion years ago. So again, looking beyond that, and one of the things I didn't touch upon that is we also want to understand where else could life exist. We ran a mission at Ames called Kepler, which stared at about 100,000 stars, which is a very small part of the sky. It stared at those stars for about 5 or 6 years to see if it could detect planets crossing in front of those stars, transiting in front of the stars, and the images, the light from the star would basically be diminished by those planets crossing in front. And based on how much the light diminishes, and based on how long it took for that light to diminish and come back, you could determine the size of the planet, and you could determine the distance from that planet from the star, just based on orbital mechanics. What we're looking for is how many Earth-like planets are there on all the stars you see out there. And just by looking at that small portion of the sky within our galaxy, we have determined now, we believe, there are more planets than stars when you look out into the stars. You can only see the stars with your naked eye, but there are more planets out there, and Earth-like planets, rocky planets. Earth is considered a rocky planet in a habitable zone where It's not too hot, not too cold. We call it the Goldilocks zone, where liquid water could potentially exist because we believe liquid water is a critical component to life forming. And so we now know that there are likely billions of planets out there just in our galaxy alone that have the right conditions for life. So what are the chances of life being out there? I think the chances are pretty good. Can we detect them and can we find it? That's going to be the big challenge for us in the future. All right. I think I'm going to end up with a little bit of family history. This upper picture on the upper left, I don't know why they thought that red outfit looked good on me, but that was me. In Taiwan, I think. I was born here in the United States, but my parents took me to Taiwan to meet the grandparents and the extended family when I was younger. So that's my parents behind me there, and then my grandparents and my great-grandmother sitting in the chair there. A lot of people ask, how did I become an engineer? Was I pushed into doing engineering? I know many people who immigrated, particularly from Asia, kind of gravitated towards engineering and science as a way to be productive and a way to be successful. That wasn't me. I was never pushed in that direction. As you can see some of those images, I loved airplanes when I was a kid. And so I grew up loving airplanes, I grew up loving air engineering, I grew up trying to figure out how things worked and how things flew. And so that was my background. I chose to go into engineering. My father was a professor of Chinese history and philosophy. He's an expert in Confucian ethics, Professor Hu Wei-Ming. And so he couldn't push me into engineering, given his background. And my mother was a lover of music and art, so she also couldn't push me into engineering, given her background. I did end up going to both Berkeley and Stanford. Got my undergraduate at Berkeley, got my graduate degree at Stanford. Had a great opportunity there because after I graduated from Berkeley, I was offered a position at NASA. I knew I wanted to go to grad school, and so NASA said, well, we'll pay you to go to grad school. And so they did. They supported me all through grad school, and not only that, my research work was the same as my dissertation work. And so that really aligned well, and that's part of, back to the original sort of message that I said at the beginning, that's how I think we need to continue to foster that growth and collaboration, particularly for the next generation coming up behind us. So this is an example of a research group I was in at NASA Ames when I was still an undergraduate student. By the time I graduated with my undergraduate, I already had papers and publications. And then through my career at NASA, one of the other things that did not go the way I had planned is I always thought I would do engineering and do research. That's what I love to do. If you ask me if that was my goal, I would say absolutely. If you ask me if I ever wanted to go to management and leadership, I say probably not. I obviously utterly failed at my plan. But the point here being, and I tell that to many young folks out here, it's great to have a plan, and you should have a plan. But don't stick to that plan so tightly that you don't take opportunities that come up in front of you. That may not be in your plan. That may take you in a different direction. As soon as I graduated with my doctorate, I was given an opportunity to lead a program, and lead some missions. And it wasn't quite in my plan because I wanted to continue to do research. I wanted to continue to publish, and I thought maybe I wanted to go into academia at some point. But the opportunity, I ended up taking it, and it really changed the direction of my career. And I realized, particularly for an entity like NASA, the type of things we do are so complex and so big that any one person can only do so much. And so in order to have the impact, you need to be willing and able to lead people. You need to be willing and able to work with people. It takes teams of people, hundreds or thousands of people in some cases in our missions across the whole country and internationally to get something done. And so going into leadership and going into management was my way of realizing I could have a bigger impact in that kind of role than I could ever do in front of a computer or in front of an experimental facility by myself. Finally, we all know in the Bay Area that Cal and Stanford are bitter rivals when it comes to sports. Unfortunately, neither of them are very good in many of the sports, but that's a different story. But I really love this image because it came from astronaut Steve Smith, who went to Stanford, astronaut Rex Walheim, who went to Berkeley. I know them both well, and when I became center director at Ames in 2015, they sent me this image that they both took together on the space shuttle. They brought their banners up there, and it says, if you can't read it, best wishes from both sides of the bay. We can coexist peacefully in space. Finally, there are amazing opportunities, and I want to highlight one point that I think was touched upon earlier. So we, of course, most of our hiring and most of our activities are in STEM, computer scientists, engineers, physical scientists, but the future of space exploration is very exciting. And I think it's going to be a future that's going to bring more than just STEM professionals in there. We need lawyers to help us figure out what are the new laws, what are the new policies that will govern space. We need business professionals, financial people, because of the private sector and the investments into space that will come not from governments, but from the private sector. We need artists, communicators to really show and inspire the children and the next generation of people and the public of why space and space exploration is important. So it really is, to me, an all-of endeavor. And so while we do focus on the STEM fields, as you can see, we focus on the non-STEM fields just as much. And I think we're going to need them all for the future of space exploration. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this event. Thank you.